We're going to be talking about challenging the canon, the business of deciding what art is worthy of preserving and exhibiting. The museum field has been widely acknowledging the underrepresentation of artists of color, of artists outside of the Western tradition, and of women artists. Yet disparities persist. Pamela, you have stated clearly that the mission of your collecting and your work on museum boards is to help rewrite art history to encompass African American artists. As trustees are the ones who hire the directors and help set the priorities for the institutions, does the work of challenging the canon need to really start from the top, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Boards really do play a critical role in setting the tone of the direction of the institution. And so no individual player can really have a singular impact over the long term. Rather, I think you have to have sort of a collective mindset where everybody buys into the notion of expanding a history, telling a true history, telling a full history. Mm-hmm. And then, it's incumbent upon boards and directors to sort of disseminate not only message throughout organizations, but to put sort of your money where your mouth is, so to speak, and give curators resources to go pursue that broader mandate.
Right. One recent diversity study found that people of color made up only 9% of museum trustees. What do you think are effective ways to help recruit and cultivate more diversity on boards?
Well, I think that it's not a huge mystery. And I think that people, first of all, have to get comfortable with the notion that trustees of color or women trustees are no different than any other group of trustees, right? People are recruited for their work, wisdom, and wealth. But I think that, especially now, we're in an age where people want to engage in a way where they think they can move the needle. So in my own case, I am involved with a lot of organizations, but I have a sort of a crisp formula for what excites me in terms of involvement. So first of all, I have to have a job description on a board, and I'm interested in boards where I can make a unique difference. What can I do that virtually no one else can do? And so I like organizations to come to me with sort of that template of how I can make a difference. So I just think that if people and if organizations approach people with an eye towards what their interests are and approach people in a welcoming way. Some institutions are really sort of off-putting and a bit intimidating, but if you're welcome and welcoming and do your homework, I think it's not that difficult to recruit diverse boards.
Mm-hmm. Great. Last month, there was the highly publicized firing of Helen Molesworth as chief curator at MoCA in Los Angeles. She was very vocal about challenging the canon and bringing in more women artists and artists of color. It's hard to know all the particulars of what happened there, but clearly there was a conflict between her agenda and that of board members who may have wanted the museum to reflect their own collections more. I throw this out to Anne and to Julián. Are there ways that curators and directors can, through their expertise, help galvanize trustees around the importance of challenging the canon?
I think speaking for MoMA, it's been a thrilling time, actually, because over the course of this last, I wouldn't even say 5 years, maybe even 3, the amount of change that has happened in the museum world, in the US at least, is greater than at any time, I would say, certainly over my 30 years in the field, in terms of a rethink on the part, a big collective rethink on the part of everybody involved about a lot of assumptions that we had just not really questioned over the last few decades. And the trustees are right in there with us. I think the audiences are right in there with us, the critics. And it feels like a learning together. It doesn't feel like an us teaching something we already knew. It feels new, and it does feel like it's not going to go back. It's not going to be a sort of fashion of this moment that goes away. And that's exhilarating.
I think that has also to do with something that was discussed yesterday, is that we're living a time in which museums are also allowing different voices to be participant in the generating of contents. And as much as before it was unidirectional, I think we are more open whether to all of the influxes. So we're seeing the canon be layered. So it's not that we're changing one canon for another, but that within the different canons, it has been enriched with different voices.
Right.
Yeah, I think an important distinction to make is that we're not simply expanding the canon. I think it wouldn't be particularly meaningful if we were saying, here's this canon of greatness that we've had for a century, and guess what? There are 4 more places at the table, or 7 more places at the table. It's instead reconfiguring the way we're even imagining this concept of a canon, and an elasticity and a variety and a moreness to it that's saying, no, it's a different conception. It's not just an expansion.
Mm-hmm. And you are chief curator of MoMA's phenomenal painting and sculpture department, and that is a collection that really did help establish the canon of modern art that many of us grew up on. And how do you think about bringing in other narratives, other stories, in a substantive way that doesn't feel like tokenism, like, oh, there are 4 more places. Yeah. But while still balancing the traditional strengths of your collection.
Yeah. I mean, we joke that we, because we have this great collection, actually have perhaps more of a challenge, because no, we're not going to take down Starry Night or take down Demoiselle d'Avignon. And I think that's the exciting part. We're saying that it's not one or the other. And for us, one of the solutions, without an infinity of space, is that we have begun treating our collection as something that changes temporally. So whereas you know that our special exhibition program, every 3 months you can count on a new show, now when you go into our collection galleries, you will see things every few months that were not there before. And so there's this constant revolving, so that instead of going from A to Z and getting the history, instead you have different modules that come in and out and pop up here and there. And all of those modules are themselves interesting topics, worthwhile histories that don't necessarily have to fit into this genealogy that maybe some decades ago it seemed that they all had to fit into.
Mm-hmm. But I must jump in here and say that, further to your point, Anne, about the MoMA making changes 3 years ago, one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had as a museum goer was about 3 years ago, in May or so, going to the 4th floor of the MoMA and seeing sort of work that had been done mid-century by a really broad array of African-American painters that had not really been seen historically at the MoMA. Sam Gilliam Drape and a Howardina Pendell painting from the 1970s, and expanded work by David Hammonds, and I mean it went on and on and on, speaking to other things in the permanent collection. So I do believe, as you say, that was unprecedented.
And Julián, how have you tried to deal with that?
So first of all, if you ever don't need the Starry Night. We can take it to Kansas City.
We can talk about that.
Exactly. This is the outcome of the conference. No, I think it is true that the thing is, insiders, we see our museums as something, for instance, even the distinguish of a temporal exhibition versus our permanent collections. The audience not always know that. They always, the notion of those things are not totally transparent for our audiences as much as we think about them. So changing the collections are the DNA of the institutions, and that's why right now all of these new considerations of a younger generation of artists that we are paying attention to, artists of color, of diversity, they are really affecting the DNA, what is our collections, and that is what will last for the long run. And one of the things that I'm also very interested in is how also, and I think this is also the case when art history is not linear, and also the recognition of certain artists is not linear. Even those that we think today are very canonical to whatever our canon is. But the exhibition at the Met of Kerry James Marshall, for instance, brought a lot of attention to an amazing artist. But the attention that brought is now that Charles White, his professor, is starting to be more studied. So sometimes it takes a younger generation of artists to recognize also who their masters were, and in that case, for instance, re-establishing the canon. So this is the exciting times we're living in, that a lot of information is now being reconsidered and a lot of things are being written. And the same would be true also with Latin American art.
No, I would emphasize, I would agree and certainly emphasize that point, that at this moment, leading the way, in many cases, are newer artists who are finding their own histories that matter to them, and we're learning from that. That, I'm sure, also is true as you collect, Pamela, that some of the older generation people come to you because of younger.
Well, I mean, what's being described here is the strategy. It is the strand that runs through our collection. So we own and love Mark Bradford, but Mark talks about how he was influenced by the recently deceased Jack Whitten. And Jack used to say to me that he would not have had a career if not for Norman Lewis. So Jack was born in 1938, I believe, and Norman Lewis was born in 1909. And so, I mean, we collect to that strand. We want to see who was influenced by whom.
Yeah, yeah.
And in part, we do that because until there was a broader embracing of these careers, what these artists had was each other. Yep. Primarily. So they had no commercial gratification, they had little critical acclaim, but they were creatives compelled to create what it is they wanted to create, and so they reinforced each other's careers. So I agree with you that the younger painters and artists are shining a light on prior generations.
Yeah, and we have to follow, actually. Today what is beautiful is that we have to follow the artist, and the artists are leading us exactly to their own roots that we might have overlooked, or a generation before us overlooked, but it is a time to reestablish.
Right. So, Julián, I know over the course of your career you have worked a lot with Latino and Latin American art. Can you talk about some of the strategies that have been most effective for shifting this field from the periphery more to the center of major museum programs?
So in the last 20 years, definitely there has been a shift. And at the time I was at El Museo del Barrio in New York, there were not that many institutions that were focusing or collecting Latin American art with a focus. And today, you see 20 years later, we have amazing programs. But many, and it is also to echo Pamela's passion for collecting, and also sometimes what I think is bringing light is individuals' passion. And the canon, finally, at the end of the day, is the love and the passion that people bring to our attention globally. And in this case, for instance, at MoMA, Patty Cisneros focus on a different version of Latin American art, that is the non-figurative tradition, and her consistency and her dedication for that form of Latin American art all of a sudden now has a visibility that it would not have had 20 years ago. The same would be now with the programs at Houston and prior to that at the Blanton. So Latin American art, it is just like any other field, is the passion of some individuals to bringing narratives. But I think sometimes also by seeing it, and we're seeing it here from a US perspective, we neglect also to understand that there were a lot of also studies throughout Latin America, in this case, that already collected this. And so sometimes, what are the networks that we're creating to also benefit and to sustain the research that has happened before in the source countries from some of this art, to bring it then in a more global dialogue? And we have, in the US, the large institutions that we represent have sometimes that kind of also loudspeaker from which we can talk, and also the responsibility that is then heightened.
Right. And Anne, how have you seen Latin American art come to the focus at MoMA?
Patti Cisneros, as Julián says, has been an incredible force over this past 25 years in looking at mid-century abstract art and bringing with phenomenal generosity to MoMA this world of work that was new to us. But what I would say about that is that it fit in to an interest that MoMA had had in the art of South and Central America since its founding. So one of the things that I think is important for museums as we embark on the paths that we are is to realize how into our own core things actually fit very well, and we don't just add on things that are sort of feel like add-ons with no roots or no connections to what's established in the history of the museum. And those histories have plenty of open channels to the kind of things we're talking about. So you find the ones in your own institution that really are productive connectors. And this is, I think, part of the reason why this Cisneros gift was such a natural for us, but also just such an enormous generator of enthusiasm from the Cisneros side and from the curatorial side, because it's always these partnerships, like you're saying. Because, wow, we had this earlier history, mainly with more figurative art. Here's what happened in those countries afterward. She just picked right up on that, and now we're up to date, in a sense.
And
Right.
if I could add to that, I think the tellers of new narratives like Patti Cisneros inspire other people to tell new narratives. So
Yes.
Patti Cisneros is an idol of mine, and I had never met her until she was at my home with a group seeing my collection about a month ago. But as it turns out, I mean, what we do is mostly collect abstraction. The core is mid-century African American, but now we're also telling the story of the global African diaspora with that focus on abstraction. And so Patti Cisneros is a key influence to how I think about stitching our collection together.
And as you think about what will happen with your collection in the future, and where you'd like it to go, what would you like to be hearing from museums?
Well, I'd like to be hearing from museums those artists that we love, how they'll be treated into perpetuity. So, you get out there and you collect what you collect, but it's the curators who are the tastemakers. I'm not the tastemaker. And so you just want to see your visions line up, your vision as a collector line up with what curators think is valuable for the long run. So I want to hear what the long-term framing of these careers would be. So context for me is everything. And, we're getting to the point where we're starting to have to plan that. So we'll begin those conversations.
Right.
I think the collectors and trustees are tastemakers hand in hand with the curators. I'll disagree with you on that.
Yeah, and actually what is nicely represented here is the ecosystem of the art world. I don't think today in the globalized and also pixelized world that we live. There's no longer that is the museum, that is the tastemaker, the collector, the gallerist, or the artist. It is the confluence of all of that. And I think that is what we're living more and more, and bringing us together is part of that, but also having these discussions together. But you said earlier when we were talking that you had a recipe. Could you tell us, how do you know when a good relation is a good relationship? You said something very interesting, and
Well, I mean, I guess we were chatting amongst ourselves earlier, and, you know, I like to keep it simple. You know, you date the guy who likes you.
So you see, at the end of the day, those are the great things, exactly. And where the collection will go, now we know.
Right. And, you know, the people who make you smarter, the people that you can have ongoing dialogue with, the places where what you do and how you think and how you approach collecting does in fact make a tangible difference, where you can measure the results. So this is where my non-art historical background comes in. I'm an MBA, not an art historian. So I want to see measurable results. And so it's all of that that comes into the equation.
And I think one of the ways we measure those results is actually the easiest in the world. We walk through our galleries during the course of the day, and we see who are in front of what paintings, right? People vote with their feet. So you'll go to a painting that has newly come into the collection, say Faith Ringgold's Die, which was mentioned yesterday. This is a painting from 1967 that Faith kept for 50 years, not out of lack of interest in selling it, but lack of interest in anyone in buying it. And then it comes to MoMA a few years ago. That painting is now as surrounded by visitors at any given moment as one of our classic Picassos or Dalis or something like that. So the audience tells us, the visitors tell us, this is what we care about, and this is what is making us come to your museum. So it's not a mystery.
Yeah, I agree.
They vote with their tweets, in my case. And, you know, and voting with their tweets is amazing. We just recently had a donation of a Kahendi Whaley about a year ago, and by the great collectors, the Hoffmans. And from the moment we installed it, it was very quickly a favorite, and we could see it in the tweets and Instagram. But the moment the presidential paintings of Obama were announced, and the fact that many more people recognize that name that had not previously, the incremental number of Instagram pictures posted or selfies in front of that painting, just incremental. So, today, better than the book that we used to have and comments, we can see what our publics are really reacting and relating to in a very dynamic way.
Yeah.
So we're going to go to questions in a couple minutes, so be thinking about those. But I just want to say, I think it's always important to remember that tastes and priorities are always changing. Julián, I know that the Caravaggio and the Nelson-Atkins collection is a huge point of pride, but it was only in the 1950s that Caravaggio began to be reevaluated, right? So, I mean, the canon is always in flux, even for the white guys, right?
Totally, and that's what I was saying. Art history is a constant relooking at. And the reintroduction of certain artists is because younger artists are looking at them. So I think what we are experiencing is a much larger canvas, but also the fact that the voices are coming from multi-generations, and us as institutions are opening to receiving that. One of the pleasures, perhaps, of this, and it's complicated, but it is how we manage to bring more narratives that are satisfying more publics, and that each of one can find himself or herself in those narratives. And technology is someone said yesterday also, in the dark ages of where it will be, but it is starting to fulfill the fact that we can layer narratives for different audiences to meet them where they want to be met, and then bring them to a bigger understanding of the different narratives.
Right.
But Caravaggio remains our most requested work of art, along with a Monet Boulevard de Capucine. So that also, you know, what has the most traction. If I could get the frequent flyer miles of our Caravaggio, let me tell you, I could be flying around the world.
Great. So, questions for our panel here? Yes, over there.
My name is Charlotte Eierman, and I'm a former museum curator and director, and have worked with many of you and also admire all of you in your different roles. I wonder how, from each of your perspectives, you see the institutions you work for or serve developing pipelines for the next generations of curators, directors, and museum trustees to fill your shoes and carry on this next generation of rethinking in terms of both training and professional opportunities, especially in terms of funded positions for a more diverse curatorial and directorial and trustee representation. Thank you.
I can jump on that optimistically by saying we have to bet and put the most resources we have on our young generations. Bringing school children from every part of Kansas City, in every neighborhood, around a very large radius, and working with them is what will open the pipeline. And when we had recently an event in which, for instance, the children that we serve from underserved communities that are Title I, and we gave them vouchers so that they would invite their parents for a night at the museum, and we provided some of the buses. When you see a 7-year-old girl telling their parents what they liked at the museum and being the guides to people who have never come before, then you know that these children will feel very comfortable in the museum. They feel it's their museum. They are our ambassadors to the older generation. So they will be the agents of change. And so over time, these people that feel comfortable at the museum, maybe taking our places, becoming board members, becoming more passionate, to more immediate change. The Mellon Foundation has given us great grants to also follow people who are in college, entering college, and mentoring them for diversity communities and bringing them into the fold of curatorial, so that also the pipeline of curatorial can be affected at a more direct time. But I think we're doing that.
So from the point of view of sort of trying to encourage board members to participate in institutions, I'm really excited and fortunate because living in the Bay Area, I live in a geography where there are a lot of young, smart people who have created great fortunes in a short period of time. And so, and I'm a pretty persistent arm twister. So I've had some success, not as much as I would like, trying to help fill the ranks of board members coming behind me. Where I do have more concern, particularly around curators of color, is, and this really didn't occur to me until I started sort of grappling with this problem. There really is, there's sort of a multi-pronged challenge in that when these two esteemed professionals were sort of young pups in their careers, the process was that you had to take low or no paying jobs, maybe for a long period of time, to work your way up the ladder to become a leader in the profession. And very often, students of color come from less economically advantaged backgrounds and frankly have large student loans that don't enable them to take that course of action. So the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, others are working to address those challenges, but those are challenges. And then my bigger hope also, and I see museums making a lot of progress in this regard, the museums have been hiring sort of more diverse curatorial talent. And then they're also becoming more enlightened with respect to not only pigeonholing the Black curator in the spot focused on artists of color. But so, for instance, at Tate Modern, we have an African-American curator who is the commissioner for the British Pavilion this year. And that's really exciting for me. So to get that cross-pollination, I think, is important, too.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we didn't touch on so much during this session is the women aspect. And of course, when museums started hiring women, which was way back in the early days, because indeed the women would take jobs that had no pay, it wasn't like those women came on board to support women artists. And in fact, for many, many years, they didn't, because they didn't feel that they could afford to hook their wagon to that particular cause. But what I loved about what you said is actually, if it is financial, a challenge to getting into the curatorial or other museum jobs pipeline, younger people from less likely backgrounds, in fact, money is an answer. That's an easy answer, right?
Yeah.
And for example, right now at MoMA, we have a fellowship program that we did jointly with the Studio Museum in Harlem, which is we identify kids post-college. They spend a year at MoMA and a year at the Studio Museum to get the kind of boutique museum and larger museum experience both under their belt. And we learn from them, since they have both of those experiences by the time of their second year, and they're phenomenal. But they're paid decently. And it's a very simple solution at one level.
We'll have to work on that.
Good, good.
Yes.
Farah Nayeri, I cover culture for the New York Times. I had a question for Anne Temkin. You said that you are, of course, not going to take down Starry Night and Demoiselle d'Avignon to make space for art by newer artists. What happens to the yardstick, though? Because the yardstick by which we measure, you know, Van Gogh and Picasso is not the same yardstick, I presume, by which you measure an artist who's coming along, who came, you know, to the fore in the last 10 to 15 years. Is there a kind of quote-unquote, I hate to use the word, but dumbing down going on? I mean, how do you do this? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's easy, because we've done that since we began, really. We've been a two-track program, in a sense, of works that even when they were bought in the 1930s were already 40 years old and considered masterpieces, like Starry Night, and then buying in the present, right? Even when we were buying works of the 40s or 50s or 60s in the present, that was just as new and unsure and speculative as what we're doing today, just perhaps, or not even, because we were doing it quite widely then too. It's just been forgotten that we were. So it's just a little bit of a cognitive dissonance when you're buying things and you're buying something 70 years old and you know exactly why you are, and at the same time you're able to buy something by somebody who you fully acknowledge may turn out to not be a name that's known 100 years from now, but we do both at once.
Of the greats, you know what I mean? Like, how do you show them?
How, generally, the question was how we bring the current artists into the mix with the greats. And most conventionally, when you go through the museum, you go from the past to the present, or the present to the past, if you're, but in fact, lately, we've been mixing that up a little bit too, because when, again, learning from artists don't look from the classifications that art historians make. Artists look for great things that speak to them from any time and place. And that's a liberating path to follow too.
Right. Robin?
I just wonder, since you all seem to be on the same page with this being an important, you know, thing to do, to what extent do you encounter pushback? Is any of this an uphill battle? Is there resistance? Is there anyone who's not on the same page and doesn't think this is a good idea to be kind of changing things up and looking at things differently? Pamela,
So about 10 years ago, I got actively involved with Tate Modern, and Nick Sirota was really very welcoming, and it's really been a transformational experience. But I had a funny conversation at the time I decided to roll up my sleeves and get involved with Hilarie Sims, and I said, Hilarie, you know, I'm going to do this work, and we're going to try to catalyze a change in the canon. And she said, darling, good luck with that. But, you know, Hilarie comes from a generation where she was, you know, the first and the only for a very long time in, you know, the largest institutions in New York. And so had I been trying to do some of the things we're trying to do now 30 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, I would have potentially encountered significant pushback. I can say that that is absolutely not the case at any of the organizations in which I've been involved. People are curious, they are open, they are embracing, and then they say, oh, that's nice, we have you, and who else do you know that is like-minded? And so I do think, I agree with the panelists where I think that this is not just a trend, it's a sea change, and I think it's here to stay.
That's a nice place to